The British. Generally poorly trained, the British enlisted soldier was also poorly paid, often going months with no pay at all. Poorly cared for, the wounded were virtually ignored and allowed to die alone, unless a friend had time to help. Poorly fed, salt, salt beef, dried peas, and tea were mainstays. And poorly treated, tied to a wagon wheel and flogged until his back was shredded for the slightest infraction. And yet, somehow, amazingly, up until the War for Independence, he managed to conquer most of the world. Young British officers in England, when they were being shipped out to fight in the colonies, were told to "settle your affairs and make out a proper will, because the riflemen will almost certainly kill you." Chapter 6. As he walked, Samuel felt as if he were following some kind of a killing storm. Even the tracks seemed savage. From the footprints, it was evident that the prisoners, tied together, were constantly jerked and pulled to increase their speed. Their prints were scuffed, ragged, and he felt his mother's anguish terribly. She was small and thin, and very strong in her own way, but this brutal treatment, probably with a rope around her neck, might be too much for her. If she was too slow, they might— He could not finish the thought. The shock Samuel had felt since he had come upon the devastation in the settlement and dealt with the bodies had left him numb. Now it turned to anger, coming into rage, and that was worse, because he had to remain calm. He had no idea what to do except follow his parents' tracks. He saw their footprints now and then. He had to follow and rescue them. How could he do that, free his parents? He'd have to wait and see, until he knew more. He would learn by studying sign. He could not forget himself and his skills now. The people who were leaving the tracks were the people he had to deal with. He had to understand them by the time he caught up with them. He stopped and tried to slow his harsh breathing, tried to still his mind and remember all he had taught himself about studying trails in the surrounding ground. It seemed that all of the captors and captives were walking on the trail, but there might be others off to the side. Quickly he started to swing to the left and right of the trail. It was mostly grass, and hard to read, but at last he saw scuff marks and some moccasin tracks in open dirt. They had scouts on each side of the main group. On the second swing he found the first body. It was a man in his 30s who had been picking berries when they had come upon him. He must have had a rifle or a musket. No one would be out in the woods without some kind of weapon. But it was gone, along with his powder horn and his possibles bag. He had been scalped, mutilated. Sadly, there was no time for Samuel to give him a decent grave. He scraped a slight trench with his knife and covered the body with a minimum of dirt. He bowed his head, then went back to the trail. Covering the body hadn't taken much time, but it had upset him. As he walked on, he tried to still the shaking of his hands. He picked up his speed and came into the clearing of the next settlement before he was ready for it. He thought he knew what he would find. It was just the few cabins, but unlike Samuel's home, it had a name— Drapers' Crossing. And it was gone. At first, it seemed the same devastation he had found at home, smoke rising from the burned cabins and sheds. But when he stopped, he saw that he wasn't alone. On the southern side of the clearing, there was a figure. It was an old man. As Samuel approached, he saw that the man was spading dirt with a wooden shovel onto a mound that was clearly a grave. And he was singing, "Rock of ages cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Samuel stopped 10 yards away. He saw no weapon, but he stood ready, rifle held across his chest, thumb on the hammer. As the old man patted the dirt with the shovel, Samuel could see 4 other grave mounds where the cabins had been. The man said in a sing-song voice, "There to sleepy little darling, there to sleepy with the Jesus boy, all to sleepy little darling, all to sleepy with the Jesus boy." Samuel coughed, but the old man did not turn. Jesus came, the Jesus boy came and took them all up to heaven. How long ago were they here? Samuel finally interrupted the man's song. The man turned toward Samuel and kept up his singing. Lordy! Then the Jesus boy came and took them all to heaven. There was Draper and Molly, and they all came in and took them all to the Jesus boy. How long ago? Can you tell me when they were here? In the dark they came, took them all to the Jesus boy, took them all, but not to old Bobby. Oh, no, sir, didn't take old Bobby, 'cause old Bobby, he sat eating dirt and pointing up at the Jesus boy and talking through his ear holes, and they thinking old Bobby was tecked, but it wasn't so, wasn't so, wasn't so. Water. Is there water or food here? Wasn't tecked at all. Just knew how the Jesus boy could save us, save us. So I sat there eating dirt and laughing and praying. With piercing, intense, and otherworldly green eyes, he stared, but not at Samuel. He looked through Samuel, at some far place that only he could see, only he could know. He picked up the shovel and started walking off to the south, where Samuel could see one more burned cabin. Beside it lay what looked like a pile of rags, but Samuel knew it wasn't. One more body. Now he remembered something he had heard about the Indians. Considering that he had lived his whole life on the frontier, he knew very little about them, and what he did know he had learned by listening to adults, to rumors and stories they sometimes told after they had a little bit too much hard cider or blackstrap rum. He remembered that some tribes saw crazy people as graced by the higher power, and that they believed that old people who did not think straight should be protected, or at least not harmed, which must be why they had let old Bobby go. Maybe he is crazy, Samuel said aloud, watching him walk away with the shovel. And maybe not. Either way, he's alive. He turned back to the trail. If old Bobby was right and they had come in the dark, probably just before dawn, if they had stopped to rest at all, that meant Samuel was gaining, and that meant he had to keep moving.